Anyway, let's see. There's too many slides. Most of them are just photographs, so I'll go through them fast. Okay. Oh gosh, I tend to walk about. Go.
Yeah, no, like once I attended a conference, mostly with the sociologists, and then they were so surprised that I was moving because they were all reading from a script. I'm like, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I don't do that. I tend to walk about, but it's a small room, and let's see if people can hear what I say.
I'm the speaker.
Okay, but I don't have to stand in front of it for that to work.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We're still waiting for the last time. Okay.
بيجي في شيء عامل بارازيت تحت. اوكي راح الصوت.
Yes. In that which I think is most academic conversation.
هذا الأفضل عمله
Exactly.
بس
لا هيدي كاملة يعني نفتح بادجت ننزل هيدي حطها هون مثلا وبفتح شيء ثاني
حاطط نوتس
وحتى للترجمة العربي هون الانجليزي من هون في جبته ألف يوصل النتيجة بس مشكلته انه ما فيك تغير له رامات يعني هذا مثلا 8 ما بس كان بدي انا 16
8 more than you need
بس معناه اذا بدي illustrated او شيء شوي لا we're supposed to
Hello. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hello. Hello. شو يعني لما يطلع هونيك ليش هديك عم تعمل عني
No, yeah, I know Tom. But he came. He was famous for teaching. The least popular. Oh, really? The other guy was I mean, it's something to be because he's still using the, you know, just like just the more I think once the I mean the machine is yeah, that is really existing.
You. Welcome. Thank you for being here, and sorry for being late, but we're going to start now. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you for the organizers, everyone who helped with this event, especially the IFI team and the BOBST team at AUB. I would also like to thank Nasreen Salti, who was instrumental to this event. And so today we're here to discuss economic and political crisis and nation building, with a special focus on Lebanon. So our speaker is Dr. James Robinson. He's an economist and political scientist. He's currently a professor at Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago and the director of the Pearson Institute. One of the central themes of his research is the relationship between political power, institutions, and economic development. The regional focus of his research is Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And with Dan Asimoglu, they published three books that synthesizes their research on politics and economics. The first is Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, and followed by Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, and most recently, The Narrow Corridor. Dr. Robinson will share with us his thoughts and ideas about Lebanon in the current crisis and discuss potential path and possibilities out of the debacle that we currently live in. Joined with Dr. Robinson, we have three distinguished panelists. I'm going to start from left to right. I guess this left. So Mona Harb is a professor of urban studies and politics at AUB and the co-founder and research lead at the Beirut Urban Lab. Her research investigates urban governance and city making in context of disasters and polycrisis. and the role of urban activists in collective action and oppositional politics. She is the author of several books, journal articles, and book chapters. Next to Dr. Harb, Dr. Joseph Bahout is the director of Isam Faris Institute. So he's our host here. And he's associate professor of politics at the Department of Political Studies and Public Administration at AUB. Dr. Bahout is a scholar, an author, and a political commentator. He's an expert in the politics of the MENA region with a focus on Lebanon and the Levant. And finally, Rosalie Berthier, she's the co-founder of the Beirut-based research center, Synaps. Synaps. She currently manages Synaps work on Lebanon and personally investigate the economy from a people's perspective, which we want to hear today. In 2017, she published a reference article on the fragility of the banking system 18 months before the start of the financial crisis. Her most recent work focused on the invisible ways in which poverty permeates Lebanese society. Yeah. I will invite Dr. Robinson to start with the presentation, and then after that, we'll have conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here in Lebanon and learning about your country and all the challenges here. But I should say straight away that I have no intention whatsoever in telling you anything about Lebanon. I'm just going to give some general thoughts about politics and political economy of reform and political economy of transition. And I'm going to end up saying some very cheeky things. My wife said it was very cheeky. I'm going to say some cheeky things about Lebanon as a way of sort of provoking discussion, but it would be extremely pretentious of me to start talking about Lebanon. I'm just not well enough informed or knowledgeable. I'm here to learn. So I shouldn't talk too much because I want you to talk, not me. But it's just a way of sort of breaking the ice, you know. That's how you should think about it. Okay, so, and you know, here's the question I want to start with. Why isn't the whole world developed? And I'm not going to talk about Lebanon, but I am going to talk about Zimbabwe instead, you know, and you may or may not think there's comparisons between Zimbabwe and Lebanon. But this is a photograph I took in Harare when I was doing field work six years, or going on for 6 years ago, at night. I was coming back from a restaurant, typical scene at night may remind you of Beirut, no publicly provided electricity in Harare. Okay, so we're driving at night, there's no street lamps. We turned the corner and something was strange. You know, there's something odd. I was kind of uneasy. Something's happening, like what's going on? And then I suddenly realized, what's the difference? There's street lights. So I said to the taxi driver, what the heck is going on here? And he said, oh, this is the road to President Mugabe's residence. Okay, so that picture, you know, that sort of says everything about, you know, what my book, Why Nations Fail, in like 3 photographs. You know, there's poor countries, there's under provision of public goods like electricity. Some people have public goods, you know, but they tend to be people who are politically powerful and politically influential. And you know, if I could, so that's my book in 2 photographs or 3 photographs. And you know, just you know, to talk about Lebanon later on, I want to say, you know, Zimbabwe has about the level of income per capita it had in the 1960s today. So it's like 60 lost years. And it's significantly poorer than it was in 1980, when the present government, which has been in power for 43 years, came to power. They came to power in 1980. Income per capita is about half of what it was when they came to power 43 years ago. And in 2000, you can see there was a staggeringly large drop in income per capita. So why is Zimbabwe poor? You know, why isn't the whole world developed? Well, there's some connection between politics and public good provision. And as one CEO, during my fieldwork, I interviewed the CEO of a large multinational, US multinational that I can't mention. And she said to me, I was asking her about Zimbabwe and trying to think about the politics. And she looked at me at one point and she said, "What's your problem? Like, it's really not complicated. It's really not complicated. I don't know why you think this is so complicated. There's plenty of money in this country for 300 people. Okay, so the population of Zimbabwe is about 10 million. She said, if you want to understand the problem in Zimbabwe, the first thing you need to know is there's plenty of money for 300 people. Okay, so I think, you know, that's the story of Zimbabwe. And you know, of those 300 people, she started telling me who the 300 people were, and 200 of them were military officers. I mean, she didn't really tell me all 300, but she started telling me, and 200 of them were military officers. Okay, but I think the point is, those incentives are present everywhere, you know, in every country of the world today and historically. There's always incentives for some elite, you know, be it military or otherwise, or political, you know, 300 or more to set themselves up, you know, and enrich themselves, you know, while impoverishing the country, as you saw in the case of Zimbabwe. Okay. And why? So a lot of my research for the last 30 years has been about, you know, why is that situation so enduring? Why is Zimbabwe sort of stuck in that situation? And I think one of the obvious things, you know, is that organizing the economy to create prosperity seems to mean, and I'm going to come back to that you know, it seems to mean giving up political and economic power, which the powerful don't want to do. And you could sort of say, in some sense, the secret, you know, my own country, Britain, is that it managed to make a transition out of a situation like that to a situation which was much more conducive to economic prosperity, but it allowed the elites to be happy with that. Okay, and you know, just to show you some real evidence on that, it's still true today. Of course, it was much truer historically. It's still true today that if you have a Norman French surname, you know, in 1066, England was invaded by the Normans, and if you have a Norman French surname like Neville, for example, you're still far more likely to get into Oxford and Cambridge than somebody with a Scandinavian name like Robinson, you know, for example. Okay, so holding constant your characteristics and your school achievement, you're still much more likely to get into Oxford and Cambridge. So the aristocracy never went away in England, and in many ways they kept their privileges, but they were made to be content with this new society that emerged in the 17th and 18th century. This is from Greg Clark's book about historical social mobility around the world. Okay, so if those incentives are there everywhere, you know, you could turn the question on its head and say, you know, why isn't the whole world developed? But why isn't the whole world like Zimbabwe? Of course, many places are, unfortunately, but many other places made a transition out of the kind of equilibrium that Zimbabwe was in. Of course, 17th century England, the equilibrium was pretty extractive. It didn't have the same characteristics as Zimbabwe, of course, okay? And how does that happen? You know, so that seems to be, you know, what Ali wanted me to talk about. How does that transition happen? You know, how does Zimbabwe kind of extract itself from this equilibrium? It's failed to do it for a long time, but how could it happen? So in Why Nations Fail, we emphasize a lot sort of collective action. So there's a lot of people suffering in Zimbabwe from this situation. Okay, so what we emphasize is collective action from the people who are suffering from this situation. In particular, we kind of make that conditional on what we call a broad coalition. So there has to be a big enough sort of cross-section of society protesting against the situation. Okay, and you know, we pick examples like apartheid South Africa. You know, you could say the apartheid, the white system in South Africa collapsed, you know, in 1994, made this transition to black rule, you know, because it became completely impossible to sustain that equilibrium because of the collective action of, you know, of the excluded, you know, the discriminated, and of course also a lot of foreign pressure, sanctions, etc. And we start the book, you know, perhaps humblingly so, with the Arab Spring. You know, so here's the Arab Spring. You can interpret the Arab Spring as people protesting against the extractive institutions in Tunisia and Egypt, in many other places. And that, but just mentioning the Arab Spring, you know, you see how complicated this is to kind of make a transition in this way, you know. So even in Tunisia, which seemed to be the poster child of the Arab Spring, there's now, you know, a kind of autocratic regime seems to be consolidating itself. So now nowhere in the Middle East did the Arab Spring actually lead to big transitions in institutions, it seems. Okay, so that's just to say, you know, that needs a lot more under the conditions under which successful collective action leads to this transition is probably not well developed in Why Nations Fail. Okay, we lack good generalizations. Okay, but I guess, you know, you'd also say as an economist, well, even in more autocratic systems, there ought to be huge advantages, you know, in reorganizing things if you could do it. You know, if you could do it, if you could maintain your political authority or you could maintain your economic interests or economic advantages, there ought to be huge incentives to do that. Okay, if you can, if you can manage to minimize the political consequences of the status quo, or if you can guarantee that there's no economic losers from that transition. You know, so I sort of hinted, like, you know, having a Norman French name still helps you in Britain. You know, that in some sense was part of a historical social contract that allowed the society to move on while keeping the elites content with that transformation. Okay, so I want to talk about that. You know, but I also want to say that's, you know, in a more autocratic situation, there ought to be incentives to change things. So without collective action, getting rid of President Ben Ali or President Mubarak, could it not be, you know, that the sort of autocratic institutions reform themselves, you know? And of course, in more democratic systems, we have this other idea that people ought to have more instruments for pressuring change. And you know, and I think there are good examples. There are salient examples of transitions towards more inclusive institutions in democratic contexts, even with many imperfections in the political institutions. You know, so I won't talk about Britain, but if you think about the Indian case with a very clientelistic political system in the 1980s and 1990s, a kind of what I call a salient enough interpretation of society's problems arose, which was the licensed Raj, or this particular way of organizing the economy, was very costly to society, and then it was dismantled. It was the force of political competition that aided that, and that's the same in Colombia. You know, so in Colombia for decades, the Colombian government lived with all of these Marxist guerrillas, and then the perceived cost of that just increased. And then democratic elections put President Alvaro Uribe in power, and he sorted the problem out in 5 or 6 years. Okay, so that had been discussed for many years, but it took the emergence of a salient enough interpretation of society's problem to really get the politics to focus on it. Okay, so there's kind of autocratic mechanisms and more democratic mechanisms, you know, just sort of decentering this emphasis on collective action, which we have in the book. Okay, so I want to say, you know, thinking about these transitions and how is it that you make these transitions, under what circumstances could you imagine more or less, you know, autocratic or more or less democratic regimes could actually start structuring things in a different way, start structuring institutions in a different way, start structuring state institutions or economic institutions. And, you know, particularly in the, you know, using the language of our book, kind of making them more inclusive in a way which would stimulate kind of prosperity. You know, what circumstances would tend to, what sort of circumstances would tend to encourage that in a world where, you know, the 300 people in Zimbabwe, to take an extreme example, fear that if you do it any other way, they're never going to be able to maintain their position. Okay, so that's why I emphasize, you know, how do you create more inclusive institutions in a, you know, where the incumbents are extremely worried about the political and economic, the adverse political and economic consequences of that. Okay, so you know, and I think, you know, what I would say, you know, this is not in any of my books, but just, you know, just trying to think about this talk was, I think you see similar sorts of challenges, you know, and a similar kind of repertoire of strategies in countries that sort of made successful transitions, you know, towards more inclusive institutions, like that elites decided to make that transition. Okay, I don't want to talk too much about this one. I think one thing that sort of strikes me, you know, about many reforms is, you know, you reform, but you pretend you're not doing anything new. Like reforms often say, no, we're not doing anything new. We're just doing something. Of course, the Bolsheviks said they were doing something new, but many reform instances don't. They always just say, no, we're just recreating something that was lost in the past. We're not doing anything new. But you have to do something visible and symbolic. Okay, so I just give, you know, so there's a sort of theatrical element of kind of change to get people to sort of believe something's happened and to get them to coordinate on a new type of equilibrium. You know, I just give one example. I have many examples, but here's one of my favorite examples, which was, you know, how do we know something different is happening in South Africa? Well, there's a constitution, there's a political process, but rugby was like the white sport. And so Nelson Mandela puts his Springbok, you know, shirt on, which was kind of sacrilege, you know, for the ANC. And he appears, you know, when the white team won the World Cup, you know. So this was a sort of very symbolic moment of kind of reconciliation. And we're going to live with these white people now. We're going to stop killing them or trying to kill them, and we're going to live with them, you know. So that really kind of showed people something different was happening. One thing, you know, which also you see in many of these transitions is, you know, lots of bad things go on in, you know, in extractive political institutions like patronage. But it turns out that it's difficult to get rid of patronage. And maybe it has to be grandfathered out over time, but it could also be combined with institution building, you know, and I'll give you one example from Colombia. I mentioned President Uribe. So one thing which was like really amazing when President Uribe was in power, here he is on stage, you can't really see him very well, but he's in what they call the Consejo Comunal. So every Saturday when he was president, he would go to some remote rural municipality with his ministers in helicopters, which no Colombian president had ever done in his life. He went to more municipalities. He claims to have been to every municipality in Colombia, but I don't think that can be true because there's about 1,400 of them. So I don't think he could have done that, but this is called San Jose de Guaviare. This is in the eastern plains, in, you know, the Orinoco plains. You know, and here's his event. He shows up, they put up a stage, and, you know, he's the first Colombian president to ever be here. There's 1,200 people in the audience, supposedly. And what did they do? He'd sit there all Saturday, and people would complain about stuff. Okay, so this was simultaneously kind of state building. It was kind of projecting the state into the periphery where it had never been before. This typically went along with a plan to build a police station. So President Uribe built a police station in every municipality, which had never happened before. But of course, it was also a massive patronage opportunity. People were there asking him stuff, and he was giving them favors. So he managed to combine institution building with patronage. So I think that's a very interesting example. There's many. That's how President Kagame runs Rwanda as well. Okay. You know, another thing is, you know, in a successful transition, one thing you see is, you know, here's former US President Harry Truman. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. You know, many transitions involve difficult things, and there are veto players. And a very common strategy is to get the veto players on the hook by giving them credit for things that they didn't do. The former mayor of Bogota, Antanas Mocos, was a kind of genius at this. And Robert Moses, if you've read Robert Caro's book, if you're interested in political economy, one of the best books about real-life political economy is The Power Broker, which is the biography of Robert Moses. And Moses had all these, he's the guy who built New York City, he built Shea Stadium, he built Jones Built Park, he built all these freeways, he built Carnegie Hall, he built these parks. He just like, how did he do that? How did he provide all these public goods? Well, politics is how he did it. And he used many strategies, and this was one. This was when he gave then governor of New York State, Franklin Roosevelt, the credit for something that Roosevelt actually opposed and tried to stop. And he stood up and just gave him the credit for it. You can get an awful lot done good done in the world if you're willing to let someone else take the credit for it. So I'm just thinking about, like, this is just, you know, some obvious things. Try to avoid creating losers. You know, I gave the example of the British, if you have a French Norman last name. In the book, in Why Nations Fell, we talk a lot about the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and the kind of creation of a constitutional monarchy and the start of a state, a modern state. What did elites in Britain worry about? Taxation. Okay, so one thing they did after 1688 was, for the first time, they created a modern bureaucratic tax institution, the excise tax. Okay, so here's excise tax. Who do excise taxes fall on? They're very regressive. They fall on poor people. This is tax on beer and bread and things like that, these consumption goods. Okay, what did the elites worry about? Land taxes. Okay, so at the same time they bureaucratized the excise tax revenues in Britain, they didn't touch land tax. Land tax administration was never bureaucratized. And you can see, this is a graph from John Brewer's great book, The Sinews of Power. You can see that during the 18th century, land tax revenues wither away. Excise taxes revenues ramp up and fund the state. So the state funds itself. This is completely the opposite of what the World Bank would tell you to do. Okay, these taxes are regressive. What you should have is progressive taxes. You know, you should be taxing rich people. That's not what they did in Britain. They didn't tax rich people at all. They taxed poor people with excise taxes because that was what was politically feasible. And not taxing land was part of this deal that allowed the British aristocracy to persist and be happy, be content with the transition. You know, that's kind of what the Chinese did also. This is from Ying Qian's book about Chinese transition. When the Chinese did this transition, you know, what they call the dual track reform, that was exactly designed not to create losers. You know, so this is just looking at state employees. What you see is like an enormous expansion of private sector employment, but state employees were left alone. They were grandfathered out. They weren't fired. They weren't downsized. You didn't have all this privatization like you had in Russia, for example. They were made content with this transition to a market economy. Okay, so I'm just trying to say, you know, that my perspective, a lot of my research has been about these political problems of transition. You know, there's another way of doing things that creates much greater wealth collectively, but the problem for the incumbents is, how can they control that? They don't see how they can control that. So are there mechanisms which allow them to see a different world in which they'll still be successful, or they'll still be on top, or they'll still have the status that they had in the old institutions? And when I look at many of these successful transitions, that's the secret. You know, in Why Nations Fell, we emphasize a lot this sort of collective action. President Ben Ali goes off into exile. You know, they lost. Okay, you see examples. We have many examples in the book, but I don't think it exhausts what happens. Okay, so let me make a transition to talk about Lebanon. And here's one thing also which I always think, you know, and I put, this is my cheeky photograph, you know, which is, I think in many transitions, you know, you need a narrative. You need to know kind of where you're going. You need ambition. You know, you need to be a romantic, you know. So dreaming and ambition are good, I say, you know, showing a photograph of downtown Beirut. Okay. So, you know, it's a cheeky attempt to bring the discussion to Lebanon. Okay. So I would say, you know, if I thought about sort of Lebanon from this lens, through this lens, and like thinking about the history of Lebanon and the sort of narratives that people have of Lebanon, is that, you know, Lebanon was a sort of success story until the 1970s. You know, it was democratic. It was the one, you know, very successful democratic, you know, society in the Middle East. I don't know how you think about Israel. I don't want to start talking about Israel, but you know, and after the end of the Civil War, a model emerged, you know, which for me is an interesting model. I'm happy to be contradicted. I may be misinterpreting things and whatever, you know. But you know, when you read about the Hariri period and you read that, you know, Hariri managed to kind of basically the state redefined property rights on the entire downtown Beirut. I don't know if there's any government in the world that could do that. You know, maybe the Chinese Communist Party could do that, you know, but I don't think the English or the American government could reorganize property rights in that way, with that restructuring and the creation of this company, and they give people shares or not, depending on who you read. And there were losers. There's always losers. That sounds kind of brutal, but there's always losers. But that seems to be kind of really amazing, for me. And what I find interesting about that period also is that there was a sort of development model, and somehow it kept people happy with that. The clientelistic politicians went along with that. They didn't stop it. Maybe they controlled what they had to control, like the British aristocracy, and they thought, oh yeah, we can live with this. Okay. So one of the things I've been trying to understand is like, what's the secret of that? What was the secret of this Hariri model? Like, how did it build this kind of coalition which didn't derail it? Okay. I'm sure you can find lots of problems with the Hariri model. Maybe you don't agree with how downtown Beirut was restructured. Maybe the exchange rate model, was a dumb idea. But I guess there was a reason why the policy was as it was in terms of kind of building this coalition. I'm saying here, if you think about people losing, I've been doing a lot of research recently on the parliamentary enclosure of English common lands in the 18th and 19th century. And there were clearly a lot of people lost from that process of reorganizing property rights in rural England. But most economic historians would say, oh, that was responsible for a huge increase in agricultural productivity. There was an agricultural revolution, and then there was an industrial revolution. So I think about the United States, for example, there was just massive losers in the historical development of the US, okay? So, and it also seems to be true, just as in Colombia, I have lots of other examples as well, but, the Hariri managed to combine some sort of state building. There were these institutions that created this reorganization of property rights, along with the persistence of patronage. I mean, again, I'm very happy if you tell me this is completely wrong. I'm just kind of throwing it out there, because I think there's a narrative of Lebanon, which is that it's a bit like Zimbabwe, really, I don't know if there's 300 people or 30 people or 3,000 people, but it's kind of stuck, and it's going to keep stuck, and it's going to persist, and like Zimbabwe. And there could be a crisis, but it doesn't matter. It'll persist. But that narrative seems hard to square with this period of like Hariri reorganizing property rights. And there seems to be a model. There seems to be, it might be a misguided model, but there was a model that a coalition kind of built into. Okay. So I find that sort of really interesting, from my perspective. Again, I'm happy to be contradicted. And I guess what I've been struggling to understand is like, what conceptually are the key elements that kind of made that work, which maybe can be reformulated in a new and more progressive and productive project. And I in sort of thinking about that, I guess I want to say also, based on my comparative experience thinking about Zimbabwe, I'm going to finish with one more other example, is that there's too much focus on the macroeconomics and the banks and all of that, here's Argentina, the El Corralito. You're having a bit of a de facto Corralito at the moment, like depositors are basically being expropriated, okay? That's what happened in Argentina, when the fixed exchange rate, 1 peso to $1 collapsed. 75% of people's bank deposits were basically expropriated by the government, okay? That was the Corralito, like the corral, everyone was in a corral, the Corralito, a little corral, okay? But did that solve Argentina's problems? No, not at all. In fact, there's hyperinflation just starting now, all those years later, 23 years later in Argentina, there's a hyperinflation going on at the moment, okay? So yeah, there's lousy macroeconomic policy, but that's a symptom of the underlying kind of political economy of Argentina and the way things work and the way the Peronist party functions, So I think I would say the same thing here, like just my reading, again, you can contradict me, I'm happy to be contradicted, is that it's underneath it, there's this politics that's creating this macroeconomic crisis. It created this, particular coalition with the particular instruments that created this unsustainability. But that's, solving that problem doesn't solve the, it's, you can see things here like corrupt judges up on the right and bancos ladrones, like thieves, bank thieves. No more banks, nunca más. Yes, never again banks. Okay, so you got the point. All right. So I hope that wasn't too incoherent. And now I'm going to shut up. Okay. All right. What do I do with this? Berthier.
Yeah, it's working now. Thank you for your presentation. So I guess like we'll start by going around and asking the panelists like for a brief comment on the presentation, and then we'll carry the conversation from there.
Thank you, Ali. I was hoping that you'll initiate it with some questions, but fine, I'll plunge. Thank you very much for the presentation and giving us a lot of material to work with. Where do I start? Well, some comments first on the framework itself. I'm not trained in political economy, and I study states and statehood and state making more from a political sociology perspective, where I do look at institutions and organizations, and I don't subscribe much to the normative take of how to reform and transition. And for me, while you were explaining, that would be a first provocation. I was trying to ask myself, like, transition to what? What do we want to transition to? What is prosperity? I suppose it's a transition to prosperity and growth. And I think it would be interesting to ask that question in today's world, in a context like Lebanon, where prosperity is a lot about capital accumulation and extraction, which are concepts you also use in your work. And the puzzle or the paradox I struggle with in my current work is how to reform a state that is extractive, which institutions have been completely hollowed out and parasited by elites who are not interested, as you said, whose self-interest is to prolong a status quo of extraction. And I think the World Bank itself talked about the deliberate inaction of the ruling elites in Lebanon as what I thought was a brilliant qualifier as a shortcut to explain what's happening today. They also use the qualifier of kicking the can, right? We hear a lot about this. And I think the past 3 years since the crisis in Lebanon, we're seeing a lot of strategies and tactics through which the can is being kicked. Nothing is being done. And there's no interest for anyone who's in a decision-making position to do anything differently. So the goal of impoverishment of people, I think, not the goal, I mean, the impoverishment of people that happened because actually of that Hariri model. So we can go back to that as well. We're paying very much the price of that Hariri model that was presented as a maybe a model that worked, but I don't know it worked for whom. It worked for that small elite, and it created so much inequalities, and we're paying the price of this today, and we'll continue to pay that price for generations to come. So I'm wondering, like, why do we want to think about a transition for a state that's extracting so much wealth and accumulating capital at the expense of its people, enriching the 300 or 200, or I don't know how many there are kleptocrats today. So for me, that whole framing, I'm really questioning it today in my work. And for me, it's like, I'm not sure this is a time where we need to reform public institutions, because the public institutions have been so parasited and hollowed out that we don't have allies that one can work with. Public servants today, if they still exist in public institutions, are so, I mean, their number is so minimal. We try in the Beirut Urban Lab that I co-direct to work with public servants who work in the urban policy sphere, in the urban planning sphere, in the housing sphere, in the land policy sphere. If we find anybody, we find one or two people and they have no teeth, they have no leverage, they can't do much, we still try to work with them, because what you're saying, like supporting people inside the state, building their capacity, seems to be an interesting way to reform institutions. But currently, with the way things are happening, I'm not totally convinced that this is the best way to go. So maybe I'll stop with that at this point, give the voice to my colleague, and I'm hoping that Joe and Rosalie will talk about the tactics through which our sectarian system reproduces itself so well. This is more their arenas. If not, I can go back to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ali, first, and mainly thank you on behalf of IFI for putting up this extraordinary event. It's not every day that we have someone of the caliber of Professor Robinson. So I really thank you for that, and thank you, the BOBST initiative, also for this opportunity. I'm afraid that, in fact, very largely, I would paraphrase or rephrase or maybe add a little bit on what Mona just said. Now, to be, I mean, full disclosure, we had lunch together with you and with some of the people here. So part of this conversation, we already had it I mean, around a very good lunch. So I'll come back to that, but this was exactly my main question. Maybe I'll put it a bit differently. I mean, when I read some of your works in the past days, I was very much fascinated, because I'm trained in originally in political economy and political science, and your work is a very interesting straddling between political economy and political sociology, which I know is not a very American discipline, it's more a French discipline. But the whole sociology of the state is something that is very much at the core of European political science. My question became the following. I mean, of course, I completely understood your thesis, your model, and I think it's a very interesting one. To put it very, very briefly, what you say is, okay, why do some nations fail, and why do some nations prosper and succeed? The question is, I liked it in one of the reviews of your previous book. It's the political stupid. It's not the economic stupid, like Bill Clinton said to George Bush during the campaign. So it's political. It's about politics. But this is the problem for me, because what you say is that nations succeed when they are able to build up inclusive institutions, economic institutions, versus extractive institutions that are transparent, accountable, etc., etc. And this is backed by also an inclusive political system, political institutional system. The question becomes, if everything is political, and this is where a little bit there is a sort of trap within your own theory, if I may say. If the problem is political, the question becomes, okay, how to force a political change in societies that are not given as inclusive, that are either extractive or authoritarian or etc. Which is in fact a reverse of you know, the transitology literature that we had in the 90s, saying that all it takes is economic transition, and then it will impose a certain political transition towards the better. What you are saying is the reverse, and I tend to agree with you. This is what leads us to the Lebanese example. You didn't want to talk about Lebanon, but we're dragging you into that. I mean, you won't escape it because you're here. But this is exactly the Lebanese conundrum. How do you, I mean, Lebanon is not, I mean, even though it's a bit overblown or overdescribed, it could have been a prosperous society. It has all the, has many of the requirements, but it's politics that in a way or another, or not politics, political economy, or the political economy choices, Harirism after war, before the war, this kind of extreme liberalism a la Shiha, etc., that made things going maybe in the wrong direction. Okay, the question becomes, how do you force a political transition in a country like Lebanon, where you have a sort of intermingling between a lot of identity politics, meaning people clinging back to certain things that are not negotiable. If we go to the extreme, you can't negotiate identity. I mean, it's difficult to negotiate identity. Between also the other intricate, I mean, the other thing that gets into the equation is, and we discussed that at length at lunch, the lack of alternative, of viable alternative by forces who pretend to be the forces of change, and by a very shrewd, I would say, political, financial, economic system, Mona alluded to it, that is very much able, with a lot of astuteness, to prolong the lifeline of a dying extractive economy. So this is the question. And if you look at the history outside Lebanon, the main changes occurred in either of three ways. I mean, either a violent revolution, so it takes violence, or the imposition of from outside, meaning an invasion, post-imperial Japan, post-Saddam Iraq, earlier on in history, other cases, or an accumulation of coalitions and alliances that will change the balance of power over time and will induce a democratic change. When you look at the Lebanese case, unfortunately, the three paths are clogged, I mean, are stalemated. Lebanon has always been under international or external interferences. It never really served the cause. On the contrary, it helped things getting worse. Violence, be it civil war or others, didn't lead to anything except worsening the situation. And the building of coalition so far is not proving right because of what I described. I mean, this mix of identity politics, lack of alternative, and etc. So it leaves us with a sort of impasse in a way or another, because your model is predicated, and I think it's rightly so, predicated on the politics above the economics, which is in a way a reverse of the classical model. If I have time, my second maybe question would be more global and more on the political economy side. Also, your assumption is a very quote unquote liberal one in the positive sense of the term, saying that only prosperous economies produce prosperous polities, or the contrary, or open polities or open political systems produce prosperous nation, because there is this kind of inclusive factor. But the last 10 to 15 years of global economy and global political economy tend to show us the contrary also. I mean, here, of course, I'm referring to the Chinese model, you know, a mix of very authoritarian political system and very, I wouldn't say prosperous, but successful economic growth model, distribution even, etc., etc. Now, of course, Mona described, and you yourself, Harirism was a kind of something like that, a sort of authoritarian modernity or authoritarian modernization that we have seen elsewhere in the region also. So where do you put these models in your model or in your theory? I'll stop at there. I took too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Professor, for the presentation. I find Mona's question very interesting about what transition do we want, and the reference also to like how do we reform the state that is extractive. I think one element that is interesting in Lebanon to understand, and to me might be different from your model from the UK or France. I'm not a political scientist, so here I'm just assuming, but you don't have a distinction in Lebanon between the political elite and the business elite. They're the same people. And so you're mentioning that in the UK, you had a transition whereby some share of the population was interested in having a change, also because they moved toward a productive economy. In Lebanon, they're one and the same, right? They're the same people who have the power and the same people who have the capital. I mean, I think we could discuss that further if you want, but it's so you don't have a push from an economic elite that would like to go towards a productive like economy. And you mentioned the Hariri model as being one that would, be different from what exists prior to the civil war. I would challenge that, because to me, so Hariri was a certain model. It had different features than the one that preceded it, but it's the same logic. It's the logic of rent and extraction, just as like through different means. It's different actors. It's mostly the real estate, mostly debt, which were new, but it's the same logic. The extractive logic was there before the civil war. One interesting aspect which linked all of these periods is the prevalence of the banking sector, which in all of these periods is extremely important in managing, extracting, and then redistributing the rent among political elites, and it's always been connected to the political elites. So that's work that's been done by one of your great colleague, Ajad Shaban, showing the connection between the banking sector and the political sector. So to me, that's maybe one I don't know if it's one problem, but it's one specificity of the Lebanese model, which I don't know if it makes it harder, but it just makes it very different to imagine that there will be a push towards change. And I very much agree with Mona about the fact that, what this political and economic elite has been very good at for a very long time has been to, kick the can down the road. And they're doing this today. They've been doing this since 2019. They were doing this in the 2000s when the country was already on the verge of a default, and they were actually doing it at the end of the civil war. It's like, how do we do more of the same without changing anything? And so to me, the problem in that model is how much the state plays a key role in that model. So it's not a weak state, it's not a failed state. It's a very active state. The problem is it's a very active state that actually undermines its own capacities, but it's very good at doing it. So it's a bit of a paradox, but it's also important to understand if we're to think about how to reform, because the state has been very good at dismantling its own ability to provide services in health sector, in the education sector, in electricity, and like most basic services, while supporting the private sector. And so it's if you want, it's a very competent actor in that regards. And so totally agree with Mona as well. Like it is shrinking, like in terms of people are departing, competences are fleeing, but it has this remanence. And to me, that's going to be a major obstacle if we want to get Lebanon to transform. Maybe I just stop at that. Is there a lot of questions?
Yeah, I could just let me. Yeah, I could just let me just say a few things. I mean, that's great. I mean, I would say, in terms of the state, they're not being what's the word? You used allies in the state, or I think that but when the British built the excise tax system, they left alone the previous incumbents, and they built this parallel bureaucracy essentially, and they just left the old system alone. In South Africa, in 1994, the civil servants, of course, were all white. They were like white Afrikaners. It was like a huge kind of tool of clientelism for the white Afrikaner government. What did they do? They did the same thing. They kind of created a parallel black civil service. They didn't hire any more white people, but they grandfathered them out. I think so. And Lagos State is another example. I won't talk about it in Nigeria. But I think there are models where it's fairly common that the existing civil service or whatever is regarded as being extremely venal and uncorrupt and whatever, but you sort of create parallel structures. Of course, parallel structures, that maybe that doesn't, you tried it. Okay, all right, okay. But it needs to come in the context of a kind of political project, I guess, which is really trying to do things. Yeah. So if the political equilibrium doesn't change, then having parallel structures won't work either, I guess. But I'm just saying, if there's a transition and there's some kind of change in the political equilibrium which allows, then there are strategies, but that's all conditional on having such a change, which maybe hasn't happened and, is difficult to imagine. It's difficult to imagine happening, I guess, from Dr. Bahout, this coalition hasn't emerged. Let me just say something about China, which is, I think, our emphasis on sort of inclusive institutions, inclusive economic institutions is that, what drives economic growth is innovation, it's creativity, it's entrepreneurship, it's, that's what we know, and that's about harnessing all the talent, you have in your society, all people's creativity and their projects and their ideas. And so you need to organize the economy in such a way as those people can get to the top, they can start a business, they can get financing, they can have their property rights protected and they can flourish, and so that's the idea of sort of inclusion. And I think that's the same whether you're looking at China or whether you're looking at the United States or whatever it is, and China flourished because it backed away from this kind of absurd communist organization of the economy and allowed Chinese people, like Jack Ma, to kind of do his thing, and he turned out to be brilliant at doing his thing. But our point is, you have to have, the politics has to be consistent with that. It's like, it's a very Hobbesian view. Politics creates property rights. Politics creates, it's not John Locke, it's Thomas Hobbes. Politics creates the institutions and the economy, and that politics did create that in China, but power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you can't create an inclusive economy at the whim of a dictatorship. That's our view. So there's many periods in world history where that's happened. it happened in the Soviet Union. You could say it wasn't very inclusive, but there was at least rapid economic growth. Argentina is a very good example up until, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world in the 1920s, but it never had the political institutions necessary to sustain the inclusive economy. So that will go into reverse. It will collapse in China. I don't know how it will collapse. It's impossible to predict, how it will collapse, but I don't think it's going to be sustainable. Think about Russia, like President Xi is surrounding himself, with yes people and his picked appointments, and just like Putin did, what did Putin do? He did something crazy. He invaded Ukraine, and that's what's going to happen in China too. I can't predict what that will be, but that's the prediction of the book. So we could be wrong, it's social science, but that's what the theory implies. Of course, the prediction is so vague. You're going to tell me, well, that's not a real falsifiable theory. But that's, that's what that's what the theory implies. And that's, that's what I kind of believe. The reason I give this example, I find this examples of this reorganization, to talk to one of your points, is I find this, this reorganization of property rights so fascinating. That everyone talks about the state in Lebanon as being kind of almost non-existent. It's a weak state and whatever, but reorganizing property rights like that is kind of absolutely unprecedented. So I would love to understand more this, you say it's not a weak or failed state, which many people portray it as. That seems to be a kind of crucial issue, for me to understand better, is just how does the state function exactly? And it seems to be very good at doing some things. Maybe it's very bad at collecting taxes or whatever, but it's very good at doing other things. And I think you know, what I've read so far, I haven't got a good characterization of the state. So I think that's why I like that example so much. It really kind of blew me away when I read that. You know, how on earth could they do that? You know, it's just something radical and amazing. So it may be bad, it may be terrible, but yeah. Well, that's the model, yeah, but they created the company. That's great. They created the company. They created this institution in the 1970s, right? That was involved in this reorganization. Yeah. Anyway, okay.
Some kind of. Yeah, sure.
Yes. So 2 points on that. So there's a when you move to Lebanon, I think Rosalie mentioned that the characterization of Lebanon as being a success story pre-civil war, I think, is contentious. Is a very contentious assumption. I think it was. There was a lot of books written that show the inequalities, the class struggles, and I think we need to take this with a grain of salt. I don't think there's agreement at all on that we had a success story of any sorts. We didn't talk at all about colonialism and the fact that we're a country that was mandated and colonized, and that, like many other countries in Africa and elsewhere, we're also reaping the consequences of colonialism that was done to, again, benefit certain interests, not of this elite, but of other elites at that time, and their allies at that time too. But there's history. We have a legacy of a colonial history that's very heavy to bear. We also have a legacy of a civil war that was not transition. We never had transitional justice. We had our warlords who took charge. Let's remember that all the people ruling us, many of them until today, were all militia people. And we never had transitional justice in this place. I don't know how we can think about political and economic transition when there was no social transition or cultural transition, and we don't even talk about what happened during the war. We don't teach our children at school what happened during the Civil War. So there are structural problems in the society that makes it not, I think, ready to think about what's the next model. And who is talking about what's the next model? Who is going to decide what's the next model for Lebanon, like we're asking? Is this going to be decided by, I don't know, like it was decided in Ta'if? Joe would be able to talk about this a lot. If we're going to transition to another model through a geopolitical agreement, that will not work, like we've seen. If we're going to transition to another model brokered by France or Saudi or Iran or whoever, again, it's going to be an imposition that doesn't resonate with a lot of people on the ground, like we've experienced. And today, if that new social contract is not embedded in Lebanese people themselves, not by international organization, not by other countries, it will never work. The new social contract, the new political economic model needs to be homegrown. I mean, it's very simple. It will never work otherwise. This is what we teach to students every day. It will not work. So for the time being, what happens, and I agree that the state in Lebanon is not weak. We don't have a fragile state, according to that. We have a state that knows very well how to operate when it wants to repress, when it wants to control, when it wants to police. If you don't have on your list the book of Maya Mikdashi called Sectarianism, that shows how the sectarian Lebanese state is able to police and repress the most vulnerable and continues to do it every day. We are in a stage now where we're repressing the refugees after we have, and before we were repressing migrant workers, and then we will repress them again, and we will repress women and children, and. So it is a state that knows how to repress and who gets money also by international organization to build its police institutions and its military institutions to repress. Yes, yes. So in many ways, we do have a strong state in certain spheres and domains, but the state provides a big void for its sectarian political actors to operate in through their institutions and their NGOs. And I'd like to emphasize that they also have NGOs, because I've been so fed up with hearing about like how Lebanon is a republic of the NGOs, as if we never had NGOs before, and we had NGOs since the civil war, and we've always had NGOs filling for the limitations of the state, and willingly so. I mean, the constitution of Lebanon is designed in a way for sectarian NGOs to take over health, health services, social services, etc. I mean, it's designed in that way. The best NGOs, the best sectarian political parties are the ones that have the most professional NGOs. Think Hezbollah, think Lebanese forces, think Armenian communities, Tashnak. Think about all these sectarian groups that have done a very good job at organizing their provision of services and sectarian goods, not public goods, or using public institution to give their sectarian goods. So what I'm trying, I apologize for going in a million directions. But what I'm trying to say is that this model has not changed much with Harirism. This was a model that was put in place before the Civil War, that continued in the Civil War with a lot of extraction and violence related to the militias. Elizabeth Picard has a beautiful article that talks about how militias controlled a lot of public resources and how they did with that. And it continued after the war in other terms. And we are now at a juncture where there may have been a possibility to rethink that model, which I think has foreclosed completely. I don't see it happening. I don't see anybody talking about a social contract today or how to reinvent the model. What we see is like, let's bring a president of the republic that suits the ruling elite. And let's rebuild something that is akin to Harirism, but I don't know under what ruling. I don't think anybody is a fan. I mean, we lost our money in the banks because of Harirism. Our parents, all the savings of our parents have been lost because of Harirism. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, the model of Harirism is that economic model, which is rent-based and which made bets and took risks that did not pay off. And who's paying the price? Definitely not the elites that abided by it. And who is going to be held accountable? Nobody. So it's really hard to think about reforming a state without an independent judiciary that will hold people accountable, that will make us trust again the system. So I'll stop here. And
yeah, actually, Mona, you didn't need my question. You answered some of them, but I want to go back to actually some of them and look at the details. Like when I look at the presentation, like my understanding of it, especially when you talk about Lebanon, is you're looking at the historic phase, which apparently in Lebanon we think of them as pre-civil war, post-civil war, or like Hariri, what you call the Hariri era. And then you try to look what are the elements that work in these phases and what didn't work, and how can we like build a new system by putting together like certain things. This is like how I'm understanding, or at least what I think is you're trying to figure out. Now, so like to understand that, we need to look at the historic perspective, and Mona just like talked about that. It's like the success, like was really pre-1975 like a glorious period. Personally, I don't think so. I mean, the numbers are scarce, but what were like health outcomes? What were life expectancy? What was mobility, economic mobility, social mobility, political inclusion? How did these, like, were they better or worse in the pre-75 or post-Hariri era or the Hariri era? And I think these are questions we need to answer them. And I think during the early phases of the protest, these were also questions, because like a lot of people refer to that as the golden era. So like my question to the panelists is, I mean, it's two questions. First, like looking back a little bit at this historic perspective, really thinking about like what was successful before 1975 and what wasn't, and the colonial route of that, and even the pre-colonial route, because the colonization didn't start in 1920. Like even during the late Ottoman era, European powers also had influence here, and they built kind of like this, the elite. And what part of the elite actually transitioned like through these phases? So that's like my first question. And the second question, I guess, to Rosalie, which a little bit more focused also on this historic narrative on the banking sector. A lot of times in the 90s, we heard that our model is Singapore, like Lebanon can be like Singapore, or like what Walid Jumblat used to call the Hanoi versus Hong Kong. So like, are we like, what's the difference between the Lebanese financial sector and Singapore? Because like Singapore is also a country that's built like financial institution plays a big role at the financial role of Singapore. So what would be your notes on that?
If I may venture to answer quickly, in fact, and to jump on a little bit the previous debate or the previous set of remarks, and go back to your model. I mean, essentially to this issue of extractive versus inclusive and etc. My feeling, okay, I share Mona's critique or description of the economic model and etc. Let's say that, at least to be balanced a little bit, that the political economy model of Lebanon before the war, albeit and despite all the shortcomings, insufficiencies, contradictions, inequalities, etc., functioned partially well, but it functioned because there were some regional and international and local conditions that allowed it to function. At least after the 40s or the 50s, the closing of the Arab space, economically and socially and politically, the flow of capital, petrodollars, Lebanon's bank secrecy, which produced probably very indirectly the catastrophe we're in today, but it becomes difficult to trace a direct, let's say, link, etc., etc. All this contributed to the Lebanese economic miracle, as someone called it, and to the Lebanese economic, let's say, disenchantment, as we now maybe exaggerately read it, because now we are suffering from it. But I mean, at that time, it was not as much denigrated as it is today. So we have to keep this in mind, although there was a critique, and a strong critique, unheard because of the balance of power in the country. The question today becomes, and this is where we come to extraction and etc., whatever our will or the will of certain people in the country to rejuvenate and resuscitate the model as it was, conditions have changed. I mean, this is not a question of voluntarism. Even though you want to reinvent this model and to recreate it, it cannot exist anymore. First of all, because the regional environment has changed. I mean, no one needs anymore a banking haven in the region. They have havens that are much more sophisticated than the ones we have. Second, I mean, this model predicated on, okay, you produce good skilled labor, engineers, doctors, lawyers, and you export them to the regional environment because the regional environment is oil rich and skill poor, doesn't work anymore. First of all, because I mean, the rentier system in the Gulf is over. There is a nationalization of skills. Things have been done. On the contrary, probably they will start to export their own skilled labor. Third, because I mean, Lebanon is today, I think, in a collapse that is very difficult to repair before 10 to 15 years. So before starting to recreate a model, you have to get over your own, let's say, collapse and your own catastrophe. To come back to the launch, I mean, we had this conversation at launch and completely agree with Mona, and we said it. What's striking today is that no one is really thinking about the alternative economic model for Lebanon. Okay, let's assume we get out of this crisis. We get out of this crisis in 10 years, which is miraculous given the conditions of today. And frankly, I think that we should take this into consideration. What if we get out? What will we do with this model? What will be Lebanon's, let's say, niche in the region and in the world? We have to start thinking about that while treating the crisis and its steps. Here I get back to the question of extraction and etc. I think that the models, Lebanon and other models, can work maybe sometimes regardless of the political environment, and here maybe it's a nuance to your theory, as long as extraction is sufficient to be redistributed in a proper way, meaning you can buy social peace and political peace with the extraction at a low cost, but it works. You quell the protest. The problem starts when extraction is not enough to feed the beast and to feed others. This is where the problem begins. As we say in Lebanon, in Lebanese, I mean, the proverb, I mean, scarcity brings conflict and problem. As long as you have redistribution, okay, you can function. The authoritarian pact, as we used to call it for the Gulf, for example, or the Arab world, used to function. The problem is that when resources are insufficient anymore to fuel, let's say, and this is the problem of Lebanon. Probably this is where the political system, in a way or another, and I hope it's not wishful thinking what I'm saying, will be forced to think about itself and will be forced to reinvent something new because the extraction / redistribution is not anymore working as before. We're talking about that also. I mean, this what is today, for example, let's take the example of clientelism today and the clientelistic networks today. They were fueled mainly by the state resource. Today, it's not anymore available. There is some other resource, which is maybe corruption, maybe money laundering, cash economy, private money, etc. But it is not sustainable. This will not be enough to sustain and support a whole constituency. So the model is failing by itself. And I think this is where your theory is interesting. The question of extraction and the availability of resources and the unavailability of resources and the forced change within the system. I think this is where exactly we are today in Lebanon, but with probably a sort of chiasm or a discrepancy between the reality and the way we think about it. The reality is already there. We are already post, call it whatever you wish, post-economy of before, post-crisis, but we haven't yet, I think, the sufficient, let's say, clarity of mind to think about it and to acknowledge it, to bury the cadaver and to think ahead. This is where probably Lebanon is tied in a sort of very unhealthy situation. I mean, something has finished, but we haven't yet acknowledged that it has finished, and we are not thinking about what's going after. Now, of course, there is something more unhealthy by the fact that certain people still think that you can resurrect what has been dead.
Just on that, I mean, I agree, but I also want to nuance a bit where you're mentioning, to me, one of the problems right now in Lebanon in the economic model is how much everybody who has an interest in it is trying to keep it alive. And everything that we're seeing now is about trying to keep things as they were. So we're moving towards re-dollarization, like the state just passed a law so that the VAT would, follow the market rate, which to me is just a good example of how we're just trying to keep everything as it was. And it is, I agree with Joe, it's not sustainable. But I never found that the Lebanese economic model was ever sustainable. And it's not about a question of, and I think this is one of its strengths. It's very good at dysfunctioning. So it's a way of functioning, like it's a dysfunction, but it's very good at it. And I think that is part of the problems you were mentioning earlier. You were saying that the politics create the economy. And in Lebanon, they did. I mean, like they've created the system, and it's a system that externalized. You mentioned that, sends expats, capitalize on right now on refugees, on aid money, on remittances, on, money from the Gulf, depending on the periods. So it is, if you want, it is a model. I don't know that it's really seen as or thought as such, but it is. And right now, what we're seeing is everybody, I mean, at least in the political elite, everybody clinging to that model for probably like a lot of reasons. I think one might be lack of imagination, but I think fundamentally it comes back to what you were mentioning, the social contract. we also have a problem in Lebanon about, what definition of a social contract we want. You're mentioning a history. So if we go back in time, Lebanon is made up of people who sought refuge in the country, right? It's a mosaic of people who came here. Like, the land was not very welcoming. I mean, it's a beautiful country, it's amazing weather, but you can't plant a lot. It's difficult maintenance. It's a collection of people who've sought to find refuge in this country, and this has consequences on how the society functions. So it's not a cultural trait; it's just a structural trait. And so Lebanese, it's a generalization, but Lebanese will find it hard to trust neighbors, like neighbors, not their neighbor in the street, but neighbors like communities. And so that's also something that the political class is extremely agile at exploiting. So right now, you have a lot of people who are in a disparate situation, like really have their standard of living been, destroyed. Their savings have been, kept by the banks. Even their political patrons are not able to deliver very much. But there is this fear of, what do we lose if we change any of that? And I think part of one of the problem is this fear, and it's honestly it's valid. I mean, prior to the civil war, Lebanon was not a peaceful country either. Like, you had lots of violent episodes. So it's not new. It's not just the civil war, and the civil war is indeed a big and unsolved case. So it's really legitimate as a concern. You were asking about the relation, like the connection between, or like the comparison between the Singaporean model. I'm not really an expert of the Singaporean model, but what I can describe of the banking sector of Lebanon, which might not hold true in Singapore, I think again the connection with the political elite is extremely important. And to me, it's not just the connection; is the absence of different interests. They're extremely aligned, and they don't have interest of their own. So I think that would be one aspect. And I think another aspect is this like rent mentality from the start. So the banking sector in Lebanon thrived on the oil boom. Like, they get the oil money, basically. They manage that Gulf treasure trove, and then like the political money you were mentioning, Joe, the money from the rest of the region. In no moment is the banking sector innovative, like taking risk. I was there before the crisis, and you'd have like all these fancy meetings or events organized, and you'd still go to the bank and have to sign paper by hand and deliver like stamps, and so they had this like kind of weird schizophrenia between like fintech, like perception or will to appear as fintech, and then this very old-fashioned way of working. Like, there is a reason why the banking sector was the first private employer of Lebanon. It's not because it was managing so much money; it's also because it was like widely inefficient. And so I think that's also a key factor, like a key difference. Like, it's not encouraged to do anything innovative. They were fed with different types of rents. The last one was the debt. It was extremely lucrative. They didn't have to do anything. In 2016, when the model started crumbling, they got like return on investment that were estimated at 40%, which is like makes no sense nowhere. And then didn't have to do much and still win a lot of benefits. So I think that's maybe one of the key difference with the sector. I don't really know.
Yeah. Actually, like I have like another comment about what Joe was saying about like the basically distributing the rent. Like, that's like the story in Lebanon. And yes, like the amount of like surplus coming from outside reduced over time. But I think one thing that happened after the Civil War is that you had more people to distribute rent to. And I think that's like where was a breaking point. And that's why like the debt policies like started, because you have to satisfy the warlords that were kind of before the Civil War many of them weren't necessarily represented there, but the Civil War gave them a stage to enter the political sphere, and then you have more people. But I mean, since we're talking about this era, and this is like my next question, it's a kind of like, I mean, one of the criticism to your book by Jeffrey Sachs is that you guys don't look much about the geopolitics, and Lebanon in that period in 1990, there was major changes in the world. The end of the Cold War, the beginning of American hegemony unchallenged, and kind of America was going around the world, like, you know, fixing regions. And this is like when Ta'if happened, and, you know, like, and the system that came up like from Ta'if was also financed by outside, and it was purposeful financing. Like the GCC countries were investing in that. Nowadays, in this crisis, like again, we have major geopolitical forces changing, not just regionally. Like now everyone's talking like in economics about political fragmentation, trade fragmentation. Basically, the world is changing. We're talking about the end of globalization. So how does that impact? I mean, this question is like for you, but also like for the panelists, like how does that impact the fact that we have these major changes? How does that impact creating a new solution?
Yeah, I won't talk about that last part. I mean, that's for the people who know more about Lebanon, but just say something about geopolitics. I think the way in our theory geopolitics enters is, you know, there are these big kind of moments where societies get reorganized. I think, you know, colonialism is obviously one of them. You know, I've done a lot of scientific sort of academic research on the impact of colonialism on comparative economic and political development. So I think, you know, it's clear that, you know, if you look at the Americas, then the, you know, North America and South America got onto very different paths of economic development because of the different ways those societies got organized in the colonial period. But just saying that, you know, sort of suggests that, you know, I could look at the geopolitics of that, or, you know, the US meddling in Chile, or, you know, invading the Dominican Republic or Haiti, or what, you know, like there's lots of layers of geopolitics, but it's sort of second order to the big picture of, you know, that I just started describing. So I think the way we think about it is there are these moments where, in some sense, geopolitics matters a lot, you know, and that has massive path-dependent consequences. But you know, and you know, no doubt you can think of other examples like that I don't think about. You know, if you talk about Eastern Europe, you know, why is it that parts of Eastern Europe are much more successful than Belarus or what, you know, because they got integrated into the European Union, and that had enormous impact on their institutions and their economic possibilities and all sorts of things. So obviously that's right. And, you know, so, but again, you know, I'm trying to keep it simple. And I always think, like, you know, many of the things that people discuss with geopolitics, it seems to be, for me, it's kind of second order. Maybe, you know, we're in a region where that's just not true, you know, and of course we don't talk that much in the book about the Middle East. And you know, I guess an interesting question for me is, you know, if I focus on the Middle East more, and you think, you know, then you have to recognize these geopolitics are very crucial. Then you know, how does that change the theory kind of more broadly? But I do admit that we kind of neglect geopolitics, but I'm trying to explain why we neglect it. It's done sort of deliberately rather than we didn't think about that. But you know, obviously we're trying to keep it simple. But you know, maybe this is you know, there's always an exception to every theory. Social science.
I just wanted to say a few words on Solidaire. I mean, I think to go back to, because you had a question on the property, how it happened. And I mean, the case of Solidaire was described by some scholars who work on this as one of the biggest dispossession in the history of of a project, a post-war reconstruction project. So it was theft mainly. I mean, people had land and property, and it was compensated for a fraction of its worth overnight. And we're talking about downtown, I mean, about the center of a city. We're not talking about, you know, neighborhoods that are in the middle of the desert or that were expropriated. We're talking about the city center of a historic city, which is a shared good for all its citizens. And I mean, I don't know if you've been to Solidaire today or what is referred to today by Solidaire, because even the name of that place became the name of the real estate company. This is not a city center. And in that sense, what that dispossession is also a dispossession at the scale of a country. You've dispossessed a country of its city center. And it's not a model to replicate. It's a model to repair. If we want to talk about a new political economy model today, one of the key issues that needs to be discussed is how we recover the city center of Beirut and give it back to the dwellers of Lebanon, not to keep it an island that is completely disconnected from the rest of the city. So for me, if there's any lessons to be learned from the past 30 years, is like how we don't do again the mistakes of Harirism as an economy model, as a completely deregulated neoliberal model. And there's a lot to learn from what went wrong. And I think the uprisings of 2019 give us very interesting leads on what could happen to downtown and how we can recuperate downtown and how the people are ready to do it. And we have a lot of counterexamples. Look at how Ras al-Naba was rebuilt. It's along the demarcation line. It's a neighborhood that was also completely voided of its people. The state, let's go back to that, adopt a different approach to rebuild Ras al-Naba, that neighborhood, with the Ministry of the Displaced, with a lot of corruption, I'm sure, but at least people went back to their homes and new people came back there. There are a lot of alternatives to what was done in downtown Beirut. And I think there are a lot of very interesting experiments happening in Lebanon for the past decades, even during the civil war, that are accumulating. And I think this is a segue to go back to the discussion on the broad coalition and what Joe was saying, like, is there a possibility for a broad coalition in Lebanon to shift the course of things? I think people who are still here in this country today and who are still trying to work against the huge challenges in this country today somehow believe that they're contributing to building that broad coalition through the little things they're doing in their little places, the tiny little increments that are trying to be built, and that where there's a hope that at some point they'll coalesce. Maybe like in 2019 it happened, but it was completely taken over by counter-revolutionary forces and even by the virus that even came down to the rescue of the ruling elite, and that who was a great excuse for them to even repress further what they started repressing. So to go back to your model, I think the broad coalition dimension is a very interesting dimension to explore, even though it's like recently I'm always saying it's like 1 step forward, 10 steps back. It's like we build a little bit and then people leave and it all collapses, and people who are championing little experiments here and there, they just need to emigrate for a variety of reasons because they need to survive. And this has been the case a lot, especially, I mean, even in this university, we lost, I don't know how many of our colleagues because of this, who were building very interesting things and they had to go. So this is not easy, but I think there's in this region overall, there's a very strong desire to continue the journey, the very long journey of struggle. And that's what keeps certain people doing that. I mean, Palestine is our neighbor, and we are in a region where we learn every day what's happening in Palestine. And I mean, Yes, there's no Arab Spring, but there are people struggling and resisting every day in the little things they do. Would that lead to a broad coalition? That's the hope. That's the imagination that some people have, that this is what keeps you going and keeps you working and struggling. But I don't think the conditions are ripe for this right now. But in a few years, we'll have another uprising and let's see what happens then.
Okay, so we'll take some questions. Do you have microphones up there or? Oh.
Hello? Professor Asmani, University Lebanese, School of PhD. Thank you, Reverend, for your presentation. Very interesting. Thank you also, Madam Dr. Joseph, Dr. Rosalie, Dr. Ali, for all the questions you asked and for all the information you gave us. I would like to remind everybody that in the 1950, 1953, the Lebanese government wanted a little bit to adjust the Lebanese economy, and they sent for a counselor from Holland. He was studying the economy in Lebanon for several months, and after that he went to see the president, and he told him that he was for several months trying to understand the constitution of the Lebanese economy, and he didn't get any answer. So he advised the president to leave the seat like that, because if he was going to give some advice, all the building will be down. This is to say that Lebanon is unique in everything, and all the models you give are good, but they don't fit Lebanon. And it was amazing to see that in the example of Zimbabwe and Lebanon, that both of us, and now we are on the top of the international inflation. So I think the problem, economic problems in Lebanon, we have as Lebanese, we have to find a way to solve them by ourselves and on a Lebanese manner, on a Lebanese voilà. Thank you very much.
Hi there. My name is Charlie Laurie. I'm a fellow here at IFI, and I moonlight with Triangle Consulting, a Lebanese consultancy. Thank you for your comments and for the discussion. I've been, I think, chewing over what I find troubling about your comments, stimulating as they were, and I think it can be kind of summarized in this, which is that certain forms of state violence are justified, if not outright tolerated or indeed encouraged, in order to achieve certain forms of economic development. And I think it's that which troubles me about what's implicit in your discussion. And I think when names like Robert Moses and Kagame are cited as role models, that seems to me to set alarm bells off. And of course that we can talk perhaps about that violence and who conducts it and who it's meted out on. And of course, it's not just humans, but it's also the environment. And we spoke about the petrodollars, and of course, Lebanon played a big role in indeed its economic success during the 40s and 50s was very much based on the fossil fuel economy. And I think Synaps has done great work there to show how that's happened. So I just wondered about this question of violence and how it doesn't really come up explicitly in your talk, and how perhaps we could talk more directly about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do second what my colleague just said. I mean, it seems that a lot of what you're saying is, you know, it really doesn't matter how we get to prosperity. The important point is we get there, you know. So, and if it's necessary that the thieves are left alone with what they plundered to stop them from sabotaging it, then okay, you know. And if it's necessary to keep patronage, then to get to prosperity, then maybe patronage is good, and so on and so forth. Now, but for a second, I mean, I would like to just like subscribe to that premise, right? I mean, put those moral or maybe ethical concerns aside, and try to think about what you propose is basically that it seems to be that if there's a transition, we have to avoid that to create losers that can actually prevent the transition. Those who can prevent the transition cannot be losing out. If they do, or if there are too many of them, or if they lose out too much, then the transition will not happen, or it will descend into violence or whatever. It seems to me that the problem today is in Lebanon is whatever transition you have, there can only be losers. There's nothing to win. The question today is how to distribute the losses and who has to digest more losses. And that's the difference, I think, to 1919. And like you were so fascinated by the Hariri model. I think there's a very, and how they were able to change the property law and how to expropriate all that property. And there's a very simple answer to that, of course, is that that also marks the big difference to today, is back then there were only winners, or mostly winners, because you had these enormous amounts of money flowing into the country, coming already or expected in investment, debt, whatever you name it. All of that money was coming in, and basically everybody was running to grab the share of the money. And it's very easy to, I think, I would argue to form a coalition of enough people or enough forces to get such a transition done. If everybody has to win something, stands to win something, it's much more difficult to form a similar coalition when it's about who's going to lose more and who's going to lose less. And losing more means, for those who are now in charge, means actually not just losing property, it also means lose power. You know, because if you do away with clientelism, then Nabih Berri is out. You know, if you do away with the control over resource streams, then the whole elite is out, or a huge part of it is out. If you reshuffle the banking sector the way it needs to be done, then all those political forces who are linked to the banking sectors are out. And that is much more difficult to organize than a collective plunder of money that's coming in.
Hi, Ibrahim Johari, researcher. Thank you very much. That was very refreshing, especially the part where talking about how to make, you know, the possible thing happen rather than just staying in the theory realm. And I really liked one of the examples, and it's the first time I hear about them, about the creation of a parallel public sector. And this idea, as Dr. Muna has talked about, has been implemented in Lebanon and is much maligned and accused of being the cause of many ills, and probably it is. But I was very interested by the example that you brought up, and saying that it might be one solution of getting away of an old, corrupt, and not working public sector by waiting it out until it dies off, which in Lebanon is probably anathema. And maybe the problem in Lebanon that they kept the two systems in parallel. So we had the alternative one, UNDP, CDR, and all running, and probably taking bigger share. But at the same time, the original public sector kept also becoming bigger and bigger. So maybe the solution was not not to create the parallel structure, but waiting out the old structure to die off. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Next.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Jim, and for the comments. But if one looks at the general theory in Why Nations Fail about having inclusive institutions versus extractive institutions, this is the kind of the model. And the failure here and the success, I don't take it to be purely economic term, but also in terms of participation, equality as well, all the other indicators also, health, education. Now, the question in your later book is, how do you become an inclusive society moving from an extractive one? And here where you say, okay, sometimes you have to make compromises. Sometimes you bring the elite in. And it's a very fragile thing. Many things can spoil this, this attempt. And of course, if you come to Lebanon and you say, okay, why is it that this move has not been made? Why can't you include the elite in a deal that would create winners, or at least would allow them to continue being an elite without having to destroy the economy altogether? Now, you pick up a particular example of Hariri as an example of this kind of bringing the elite at the same time. And I think one can also add that the fact that he built an economic model while accepting the hegemony of the Syrian regime as a kind also of making people not lose. So let the Syrian regime get what they want, but at the same time, let us rebuild the country. That was also a compromise. At that time, the military Syrian regime elite is part of that model. The question is why those sometimes fail. Do they fail because any such compromise is doomed to fail? And I think your research maybe points out to the answer, to negative answer, that many of these compromises have succeeded in the past to move, whether it's moving Athens or it's moving the US or moving to make these kind of compromises towards something more inclusive. When it comes to Lebanon, the difficulty is how you attribute causality to that failure. Some would go as far as they go, like the Ottoman Empire or the colonialism, and they don't in a way. Some of them don't attribute any success to the Lebanese system in the past, and therefore, if you don't attribute any success, you can't ask why did Lebanon do well at that point? But it's a fake doing well. That's what some of the commentators were saying, that this has always been bad. Now, of course, some people might say that, you know, in the 50s, 60s, and to some extent early 70s, there was a kind of compromise. Fuad Shahab is a kind of compromise, allowing patronage, clientelism to exist while at the same time building institutions. And many people think of Fuad Shahab period as a prosperous one. Did it fail because of geopolitical questions, the present Palestinians and the struggle over it, or did it fail because of other powers? Did it fail? So I think carving the history of Lebanon in causality terms is a complicated matter. What's not complicated, what might be not complicated, want to look at from above, do we need compromises like that to move us from a situation where the elite would want to move, and what makes those such attempts fail, and which ones in the past history, the history of Lebanon were attempts of that nature? I would say that Fuad Shahab, and in fact the Lebanese state after the independence was, even before that, was such a model of compromise, diminishing the elite, increasing the participation of the people, increasing the middle class. I would venture and say against probably that the Hariri compromise was also part of that, bringing those powers into a game that rebuilds the country. While it has a lot of objection about the way it was built, but overall it was a project for that aim. And this is the idea you bring in the bad people, in a sense. In the same way the taxation give privileges, it's not about equality in the first shot, because otherwise you'd lose the game. Of course, we lost it anyway here, but why? Is it because of the banking sector, which has been rotten from the 1920s, or if it existed, or is it because of Hariri that didn't create a strong egalitarian state and empower the public sector? Or is it that the public sector is failure? That the more you empower it, the more you suck money. The reason why, if you compare with Zimbabwe, if you go to a street now and see it lit, it's not because of a elite Lebanese. No, it will be because some private sector attempt. The streets here is lit by AUB. If you go to Ashrafiyya, you find streets lit by whoever is running, you know, maybe so this is the success here. And to go back and say, okay, maybe we should have built a strong state. Maybe I'm not so sure about that, but at least that's the complicated question about what made that compromise fail, whether it's in Fuad Shahab period or it's in Hariri's period or in all other attempts of that nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm a diplomat indeed. I'm from BOBST, Bangladesh. Might be the only one coming from diplomatic community. In fact, I'm here is basically to know about Lebanon. So it is a curiosity to know the country as I'm serving here. And it is very interesting. I must say the discussion is so exciting and so enriched. It's satisfied my expectation. And thank you so much, Professor Robinson. It is very exciting to hear from you and the panelists. I think I have a very little knowledge about Lebanon. As I said, I'm just trying to understand. But still, I think this little knowledge goes with in line with the three panelists, particularly Dr. Harb was defining the situation in Lebanon. Being a diplomat, I would like to try to be a bit broader eye look into this issue rather than commenting on the internal matters here. I think one of the issues I was trying to say is already addressed by, I think, Mr. Abboud. As I am also fan of your writings, particularly the way you define the failure, how the state fails, and what are the criteria for a state to be a successful in a nation building. I think two important things I really miss from that point. One is geopolitical context, which was being said, and I think it is extremely important when you're talking about Lebanon, of course, for many other countries. So my question to you is, while you are suggesting some reform or model, how do you want to link it to geopolitical situation where the Lebanon is staying? I think I myself would like to define this country as a victim of geopolitical dysfunction and exploitation. I might be wrong, but I think there is a case here. Second point I would like to highlight is while you're talking about democracy and democratic system in countries across the globe, how do you think of democratic global order also is extremely important for all the countries to practice democracy inside and in the global system, and to have their rights to survive, to develop, and to enjoy their own, as I said, the position and rights in a regional and global system. As I believe countries like Lebanon, countries like in many other parts of the world who are aspiring to develop, to survive, are really being victims somehow or others, this sort of system which we are failing to address in the current world, and even after 75 years of even the multilateralism. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for this very interesting discussion. It brought up a lot of things I've been thinking about for a while. So I have two hats. I've got my philosophy professor hat and my activist hat, and they put me in a constant state of schizophrenia where one is overcritical about everything and the other one has to be like quasi-dogmatic and pragmatic. So I'm going to try to raise my point or slash question, thing I've been thinking about, if you like, from the perspective of sort of lived experience, of the lived experience of being Lebanese, of the lived experience of being Lebanese historically through the Civil War, and perhaps most relevant to today, the last 3 years. It seems that there's I like the panelists because it's an exceptional group of panelists in which the fatalism that you see in society that's described is not very common. Like, this is not a representative sample, if you like, of the population. There's a generalized sense of fatalism of nothing will ever happen and nothing will ever change. That's been, part of the tools of repression, if you like. And it reminds me of this conversation I once had with one of the founders of the Green Party in Germany, where he told me that he was talking to some people from the Soviet Union in the mid 1980s, and they told him there's no way in hell that the Soviet Union will ever collapse. We are going to live like this forever. And so they never really did anything, right? So, and then the Soviet Union collapsed and they found themselves just not ready to do anything. Like Joe was just describing, that people aren't ready today to have a viable alternative to the current movement, to the current political class. The problem in Lebanon is that sometimes, because of the cognitive distortions, whether it's through trauma, whether it's through the very sad lives that we've been leading for the past 3 years, whether through the media and the portrayal of the media of the current events, there's this constant conviction that nothing will ever change, leading people not to be motivated to do anything. And then, and anyone who's motivated to do anything or tries to do anything is constantly attacked by everyone around them, mocked for, being dreamers or silly people, or trying to do something that is impossible. So that, with that societal kind of backdrop, where this is the society at large's view on change, while at the same time we see, as a lot of the panelists describe, the state actually crumbling, the current status quo being really, by all criteria, becoming unsustainable, you still have this population that's hopeless, that's helpless, that's developed this learned helplessness. So when you have a state like this, in which, again, you can't build because nobody's motivated to build, but at the same time, something needs to be built, an alternative needs to be imagined. How do you address this this problem, right? A big hole that needs to be filled, but no tools to fill this hole.
Okay, so basically, I'll concluding remarks, and you can answer the questions.
Yeah, let me just, I on this topic of violence, I'm not making a normative judgment. I'm just trying to sort of describe my understanding of kind of history and the political economy, or the politics around these kind of transitions. I don't think the transition to the Industrial Revolution or modernity in Britain, I think it was not terribly violent by world historical standards. The enclosure of the English Commons was sort of legalistic. People certainly got expropriated and they lost their rights and access to resources. And it did create some violence, but not that much by world historic, not that much by, the standards of the Mexican Revolution or whatever, So, and I don't think Robert Moses was highly Machiavellian, but he didn't kill people, or, he expropriated people, people lost their rights, and I'm not taking a moral position on that, I mean, you could argue that that's not what you want. You don't want capitalism with people taking advantage of other people, and that's part of capitalism, and it probably is. Maybe it's also part of the human condition. It just seems to me that, that what I'm calling an inclusive economy is associated with, the kind of enormous technical innovation and prosperity of the modern world. Some people don't benefit very much from that, I understand, and that's true everywhere. That's true in the United States. It's true, absolutely. People are marginalized. Indigenous people were expropriated and are still suffering the consequences of that expropriation, But I find it very difficult to make a normative judgment about that. I'm just sort of describing, I think I'm just not equipped kind of intellectually to make that judgment, that's why and I don't know if this expropriation of, I'm not advocating at all what Rafik Hariri did. I just find it sort of fascinating. When the Kuomintang invaded, in Taiwan, they expropriated, the indigenous kind of elites. They expropriated the land. They did the same in South Korea. They did land reform. maybe that's associated with industrialization and economic success. Maybe it isn't, the evidence isn't great, but I just pointing out that in many contexts, you have these big redistribution of assets and property rights. There's Machiavellian type politics. I'm just trying to understand what type of Machiavellian politics leads to a more generally prosperous society. You may still not like that society, and I respect that position. But that's what I'm trying to explain. I think it's this question of like, that's a very interesting observation about, it was a particular moment where in some sense this model, because there was a huge influx of capital, there were no losers. It was a moment where you could kind of keep everybody happy in some sense, at least for a transitory situation. And, and that situation doesn't occur again. So maybe that suggests there's limitations from what one can learn about that, because it actually doesn't work without a kind of influx of capital in the way that came in. I just find it interesting. I'm using it more as a kind of, is this an example? Even people seem to agree that it's an example where the state is actually able to do things to reorganize property rights to enforce that agreement. Yes, maybe it privatized it, but it still enforced the agreement, or there were mechanisms by which it was enforced. Maybe it's not a good thing normatively, but maybe that capacity can be used to do something which is much better for the society, for Beirut, for people. And that's what I'm saying. In the context where everybody seems to say the state is weak, the state can't do anything, the kind of typical narrative about Lebanon is there's hardly a state, but that's not the impression I get, actually. And maybe it's the capacity of the state is in some domains and it's used in some selective ways, but I still find that kind of interesting, that there's more potential for doing things than meets the eye when you just have this story of this, sectarian groups, clientelism, the state is gutted and collapsing, and then there's no hope of doing anything. And so I mean, I think, this question of why did the Hariri coalition fail? I don't know enough about the history of Lebanon. I need to know more about these previous models. Why did that compromise fail? Absolutely, that's like the $1,001 question for me. Like, and why did the pieces get put together the way they did? Was there anything about this exchange rate overvaluation, or was that just, everybody was doing it in the 1990s. Argentina was doing it, and the IMF were praising them for establishing credibility and stability and blah, 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 So probably they were doing the same thing here. Now they're all denying it, no doubt. But at the time, in the 1990s, it was a fashionable solution to financial problems in many developing countries. So maybe Hariri just got stuck with it. I don't know enough about the history of that, so just trying to understand the elements of it and how it's related to other factors, and why did that compromise fail? How it's related to previous compromises would be extremely interesting, because the United States Constitution involved a compromise with slaveholders, for heaven's sake, In fact, Edmund Morgan, in his famous book about the Constitution, argued that it was precisely because there were lots of poor white people who had slaves that allowed them to push for more, that allowed elites to allow more white democracy, because they didn't think democracy was going to be threatening to property rights, because lots of white people poor white people had slaves, and therefore they weren't going to violate property rights. How about that for a kind of messy, unpleasant compromise? But nevertheless, by world historical standards, it created a very successful society. Of course, it was more successful for some people than others, and that was a long struggle. But I just think, that's another example of, it's a very, we call it a dirty deal, in the book, but there's lots of those. And, maybe I can't take a view on, conditional on slavery existing and people thinking it was completely normal, as an institution in those days. Hard to kind of imagine that world now. But that was a compromise that had, from my perspective, I guess, as a political economist, it had all sorts of beneficial effects in terms of stimulating prosperity and investment and innovation, which created a very successful society. Yeah. And I'm not sure I really understood your question, sir, honestly. I'm not sure if it was a comment or a question, or I'm not good at the, we already kind of discussed a little bit the geopolitics. So, just in terms of this learned helplessness, it's a very nice kind of concept. I mean, I don't know enough about the country maybe to really sort of evaluate that, but I always, when I teach, I always give the example of Botswana in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a country I've done a lot of research in. When Botswana became independent in 1966, everybody expected it to be completely obliterated. So Punch, the British satirical magazine, had a cartoon on the front cover. And Botswana was like this, portrayed as a sort of little African baby surrounded by all these lions, the white regime in what was then Rhodesia, the white regime in South Africa, like it was surrounded by all these predatory regimes, but remarkably enough, they managed to create a vision and kind of build a sort of incredibly successful, flourishing society. So I kind of think that, lots of places have done that. I mean, Rwanda also is interesting. What could be more traumatic than Rwanda, without wanting to defend, President Kagame for kind of 1 minute, the guy is a gangster. But I want to talk about traumatized societies, but there's been terrific movement in many ways in Rwanda, which I don't have a normative position on that, but like, that's the case, and despite that, so I feel like there are places that recover from even more traumatic. Think about Cambodia, for example, or so I'm not enough of a social psychologist, and I don't know enough about what's gone on here, but I would guess, but yeah, so I don't want to say something facile and silly, because I understand that's a real issue and I don't know how to cope with it here. And I can see it's a challenge, but I can think of other cases which may or may not be good analogies where societies have recovered from those traumas, and they have succeeded.
I guess unless anyone else has any more comments, so I think that's the end of our session today. Very interesting conversation. Thank you for the panelists and for the speaker. And thank you all for being present here.